Welcome everyone to this week's lesson overview. We are in Acts 27 and 28. We are looking at a passage where Paul basically takes the worst road trip ever in Scripture that I can think of, yet God still demonstrates His sovereignty in this. This is the passage where Paul is shipwrecked. So that's why I'm referring that to the worst road trip ever. Basically what's going on here in the context is that Paul is on his way to Rome after appealing to Caesar. And I'm going to get a bit more into the context here in just a minute. But before that, let's take a look at our biblical truth for this week. And that is, despite great obstacles, God protected Paul for His purposes. And we're going to see how that really applies to our life as believers even today. And so when we talk about our learning goals, we want our class to examine how God's sovereignty to accomplish His purposes was revealed. And what we want them to do with this information is to consider how God orchestrates their lives in sovereign fashion to accomplish His purposes. So let's go ahead and go back to the issue of context. I want to show you a map here of what's going on because our text just jumps right into the narrative. And so let me back up a little bit and show you some of what's going on here. Okay, Paul's been down here, arrested, of course, in Jerusalem, brought up here to Caesarea where he went through this lengthy trial period. He's now appealed to Caesar, and he's on his way eventually to Rome. And so what we pick up is Paul is, they've just fixed to leave Crete here, and it's not a good time of the year to set sail. This is the time of year, it's late in the year when storms are brewing, hurricane season for us, so to speak, and they do it anyway. The captain decides to go ahead and try to make it from Fair Havens, which is on this end of Crete, and he just wants to go just a little bit west up to Phoenix, which is a better harbor to spend the winter in. Yet storms do come up, and they end up completely off course, and eventually over here on the island of Malta, a far cry from where they were originally trying to get to. And so this is the context geographically of this story. We start here in Crete, we're going to end up in Malta, and this is kind of why Paul was there, where he was going, and how all that came about. So let's jump into some hard truths that come out of this lesson. First of all, despite being shipwrecked and snake bit, God protected Paul for His purposes. And we think, well, that's great, but he was still shipwrecked and snake bit. When we talk about being involved in God's purposes and being on mission for Him and His sovereignty in our lives, we don't often like to think of the bad things that could happen to us in the process of God using us for His purposes. Even when we act out in obedience to Him, we don't think about the shipwrecks and the snake bites that may occur. And so it is a hard truth that when we're obedient to God, when He's going to use us, we're not immune to these bad things happening. And because of that, unbelief is a very real issue even for mature believers. Now, of course, we see Paul's boldness here, but guys, let's face it, you and I, when we see God working in our lives and we know that He is sovereign, He is working all things, He is protecting us, His hand of providence is the one that's moving and shaping all these events, we still struggle with unbelief. That whole thing we see, God, the man says to Jesus, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I know that's been a prayer of mine many times in my life, where I understand what God is doing, I know He's in control, I trust Him, I really, really do. But yet unbelief nags at me, and I think that's true for so many believers, even those that are mature believers, that they just have to deal with this. So let's talk a little bit about some things that we think might thwart God's will. Taking a look at this passage, some things that we pull out of here that we think might thwart God's will, because remember, we're trying to trust Him, but that unbelief is nagging at us. So let's see some things here. Other people's bad decisions. Isn't that the truth? Here in our text, it's setting sail during the storm season. That was not a very wise idea on the captain's part, but we know that this was God's sovereign plan to get Paul to Rome. But sometimes in our own lives, we're trying to follow God, and we know that He's orchestrating things, but other people not directly involved in the process make bad decisions, and we think, oh my goodness, is this going to derail what God has for me? Also, circumstances outside our control. For Paul, this is the fact that he is on this ship in this storm. He's not the captain. He's not an experienced seaman. In fact, he may have had no experience at all as a seaman, but yet he's there sort of at the mercy of the captain and his crew, tossed about by the waves of this storm. And sometimes we feel like that. We feel that we're getting into circumstances where we don't have any control, and let's face it, we like to have control. And when we feel like we've lost that control in our circumstances, we think that somehow this is going to thwart God's will because we can't steer this in the direction we think God is sending us, or that we know that for a fact that God is directing our lives. Also tragedy. This is, of course, is the shipwreck. Things happen in our lives. It may not be a shipwreck, but it can be any number of tragedies that could befall us where we think that somehow this is going to thwart God's will because it is going to avert us from what God has. It's going to knock off the timing. And if the timing's knocked off, then it's just not going to happen because this tragedy is happening right now. It's what we have to deal with in the present at the moment. It's taking a lot of our energy. It involves friends, it involves family, it's an emotional drain on us. Therefore, we think it might thwart God's will for our lives. Also, personal affliction. For Paul, it was this snake bite that he had to endure. But it could be any number of things. It could be financial affliction, it could be physical illness, it could be vocational affliction that we have and loss of a job. These things that we think when they come about that actually thwart God's will. But the thing we have to keep in mind and we need to help our classes understand is this biblical truth that despite great obstacles, God protects us as His servants for His purposes. So yeah, we may befall and be victims of all these things, other people's bad decisions, circumstances outside our control, tragedies, personal affliction, but that is not outside of the realm of God's sovereignty. He's still in control. We still need to trust Him, and even when that unbelief nags at us, we still need to dig down, find our faith, confront that unbelief, and still trust God as Paul did. So if you've got any questions about this lesson as you prepare, don't hesitate to email me or give me a call. I'd be happy to walk through those with you. And I'm praying for you as you prepare this lesson. And as always, I look forward to seeing you, God wills it, this Sunday. Thank you all so very much.